Where we want to do is pick up where we left off last time. We had been talking about middle childhood. We're looking again at the elementary school years. We pretty much had finished up physical development. We had a couple of other kind of characteristics of physical development during this stage that we wanted to review. We left off, we were talking about how children tend to, at this age to overestimate their physical abilities and may take more risks. And we had looked at a number of examples of that. We said during the previous stage, during the preschool years, that that motor skills are improving. They continue to improve. But one of the common characteristics is that fine motor skills tend also improve greatly, but they still lag a little bit behind large motor skills, and that tends to be a common theme all the way through. Can you think of real quickly some of the activities that are probably more characteristic of the elementary school years that children are engaged in that would relate to their fine motor skills? Obviously, the large motor skills, we've already talked a good bit about in terms of running and climbing and jumping and riding bikes and playing sports, And so it's easy to kind of see the things that are going to enhance large motor skills. And as you think about your paper, think about the things that you were engaged in both of these areas, because that'll be real significant. What are some things that may more likely occur during this stage that would involve fine motor skills? One of the major ones is learning to write, and again, learning to be able to control and manipulate a pen, pencil, whatever. And again, in the preschool years, they'll do some scribbling, they'll do some drawing, but the intricacy of writing is a whole nother skill. Can you think of a couple of other things that might be characteristic of utilizing fine motor skills during this stage? And again, it may occur during the preschool years, but clearly you see it much more during the middle childhood years, is the use of, and I'm amazed at this because they just weren't that prevalent or not prevalent at all, computers, again, keyboards, and video games. Again, using controls will enhance, again, fine motor skills. Building things, models. And again, my son and I are in the process. I think it's going to be a year process of building a model. But again, simply working with those small objects, gluing small pieces together. Again, younger children will have done a lot with building, say with Legos, but what's the difference between Legos for elementary school kids and that of preschoolers? Simply the detail or the size. With younger kids, you've got really large Legos, and when you get to the elementary school years, again, they still love putting Legos and building things, but again, much more complicated building structures with a lot more pieces, smaller pieces, very little pieces. It may not be uncommon for a child at this age, and not that preschoolers don't, but it's probably more common during the elementary school years to start to play an instrument. And again, utilizing those fine motor skills and learning to do that. So, fine motor skills continue to improve, but they're still going to be a little bit behind large motor skills. And finally, in terms of physical development, if you remember, we mentioned during the preschool years that children begin to get a full set of temporary teeth, and that's significant at this stage, and they begin to lose those teeth during the preschool years. During the middle childhood years is where they then will begin to come out, the temporary teeth, and will begin to be replaced by the permanent ones. Now, probably to adults that seems rather insignificant, but to the child, the loss of teeth, the replacement of teeth, really is significant to them. And in many cases, kind of a major event, probably at two levels. Can you think about what those two levels are? What are the two reasons why, for many kids, replacing of teeth tends to be significant? And don't make it too overly complicated. It's pretty simplistic. What does losing teeth and replacing those with permanent teeth tend to mean to the child? One of the big ones. Again, you got to remember from the perspective of the child is the tooth fairy. And the only thing I know about the tooth fairy is the tooth fairy seems to get more generous as generations go by. And so for children today, when a quarter may have been significant, now we're talking in many cases possibly dollar bills, and especially when they came out with the metal dollars, which are kind of neat, but I keep forgetting that those are dollars and not oversized quarters, kind of thing. But the tooth fairy, and for my son, that was significant. Losing a tooth meant money. So it was important that if you had a loose tooth, or that you might lose a tooth, you got to find that thing and you got to reclaim it. And I don't know about you growing up or if you remember much of that stage, but it was interesting, the scenarios. And I don't know if you've ever had to, and probably not, but if you've ever had to try to get a loose tooth out of a child's mouth, it can be a real challenge sometimes. Anybody think of any interesting situations of which you lost a tooth when you were growing up at that age? I remember my son lost one in the hot dog one time. I lost one, I used to love chewy candy, Tootsie Rolls, one of my favorite things. And I guarantee if you got a loose tooth and you want to get rid of that sucker, Tootsie Roll is a good bet. Just bite down on that sucker and yank that tooth, that Tootsie Roll out of there, and that tooth will come for sure. So anyway, losing teeth. What's the other significance for the child, apart from the financial gain? Growing up. Yeah, for the child, it is a sense of growing up and getting older. And again, it's another one of those things that signifies moving closer and closer towards adulthood and getting older. All right, so that concludes the physical domain. What we want to do is to shift and begin to look at the cognitive domain. Now, we're back to, again, using as a kind of our foundation theory, Piaget. Again, what we want to try to do as best we can, not get Piaget confused with Erikson, psychosocial. That's where we kind of get those intermixed. Okay, looking at Piaget, Piaget's first stage for infancy, anyone remember? Just kind of a quick review. It's not going to be on the test, but sensory motor, excellent. And then this will be on there. We talked about Piaget's second stage, preschoolers primarily, pre-operational. And so now as we move to the third stage, and you may want to kind of underline, highlight that, we're just going to do some just real general kind of overview characteristics, because a lot of really what's happening during this stage are completing the limitations of the previous stage. So if you really understand the limitations and then understand what children then gain the ability to do in this stage, it'll be pretty easy to kind of keep those straight. But the third stage is referred to as concrete. And in a moment, I think the use of that term may make some sense. So again, underline, highlight that term, because you want to be familiar with again, what this third stage is. Probably what's most characteristic, and one of the things that's most characteristic, like I said, is that children begin to gain the abilities that were limitations during the second stage. So children acquire mental abilities of seriation, which was, we'll do a quick review, just in simple terms, what's seriation? Putting things in order or in a sequence. Classification, and again, young children can do classification, but it's limited. Classification just simply means what? Putting things in categories or groups, exactly. Conservation. This is maybe one of the harder ones to remember. Exactly. Use an example of a water, remembering that if you move water from two identical glasses and you change one to a glass that's thin and tall, that even though the appearance may have changed, what didn't change? The volume of the water, or the amount or quantity of something. So even though we may change the physical appearance in some way, the actual quantity or amount didn't change. And so sometimes when kids are even, playing with something or doing something as simple as M&Ms, and you're handing out M&Ms to kids, and then with young children, and then all of a sudden somehow the appearance of how those are categorized or organized shifts, they may actually believe that they've got less and somebody else has more. And it may only be that how they're grouped. They may be grouped in a real small area or stacked up versus spread out. But they may actually have the exact same amount. Really young children may believe that they're different quantities. Older kids begin to realize that even though you've shifted, changed the appearance in some way, the quantity hasn't changed.
Another example, like we had Easter baskets and we split up our candy, and all of the Easter baskets are different sizes, and you go for the big basket because it looked like there was more candy.
Again, good example of, taking different size Easter baskets. and then looking at the perception and it may have exactly the same items in both Easter baskets, but may give a different perception that one has more, than another. But again, at this stage, kids begin to really understand that even though appearances may change, that they're aware that quantities have not necessarily changed. And this allows them to think more logically. Again, if you remember, pre-operational, before logic, gaining these abilities now begins to help the child think in more logical, orderly ways. Again, one of the other concepts we talked about was centration for preschoolers. And again, that was their ability to only focus on one aspect of something. As we begin to move into and through this stage, they're able to decenter or decentration. And this allows them to take on more than one perspective of something, to look at more than one aspect of a situation. So decentration allows children to see more than one aspect of a situation. And again, this is going to aid them in problem-solving situations. It's going to aid them in experimentation, cause and effect, reasoning, all of that as they begin to realize that there are different factors that may contribute to the outcome of something. They are capable of cause and effect reasoning. But this is what's real important. They are limited to what they already know. So in other words, if they've had experiences in life, and they've realized that if I do this particular behavior, this tends to be the consequence for it, then they can learn from that and use that in the future. But they are limited to only that which they have actually experienced. So the limitation, and again you may want to highlight this, is that the limitation is their ability to think hypothetically. Again, it doesn't mean they can't do it at all, but they have limited ability. This is one of the mental processes that tends to be more characteristic of the adolescent years. Now, when you think of the term hypothetical, what are some images that come to mind? So when we talk about that they have limited ability to think hypothetically, what are we really saying? And it is related to that previous statement about cause and effect. Any thoughts or images when you think?
They can't predict the outcome of something if they don't have experience with it.
Excellent. They have difficulty predicting the outcome of some situation if they don't have a reference from previous experience. So it's hard for them to think about the possibility of what might occur apart from what their own experience. So to think about something new, a different possible outcome, and again, this is one of the difficulties with choices that they may make. If they're confronted with a situation of which they don't have a reference for, it's difficult for them to come up with potential outcomes of that in that given situation. They only can refer back to the experiences that they've already had. They can't think of the possibilities, the likelihoods of different scenarios that might get played out. Adolescents acquire that ability, but again, they often still have very limited experiences sometimes to do that. But they are able to start to think more creatively and come up with explanations or things that might occur, that may not even be, have any rational foundation for it, but they can begin to think out there, kind of in another box about, again, those different kinds of possible outcomes. Again, middle childhood children tend to be pretty much, and that's where the concrete comes from. They tend to kind of see the world as they've seen it and as it is, and to think about other possibilities. If they have those capabilities, don't tend to exercise those all that frequently. We've mentioned egocentrism earlier, again, as a limitation during the preschool years. This begins to decline with age, and this influences social interactions. Now, first off is just a quick review. What is egocentrism? Okay, again, egocentrism being that, they tend to believe that life kind of centers around themselves, and they tend to believe that other people tend to see the world as they do. And again, this begins to decline as children get older. Now, how does this, can you think of just a couple of examples of how this declining egocentrism is going to affect social relationships? Begins to happen here and obviously is going to carry right on over, ultimately through adolescence and into adulthood. Why is that significant that that does decline? And how does that shift or change my interactions with peers or with other adults or with my parents? What do I begin to realize? Okay, one of the realities is it's not all about them. Can you think of some kind of specific examples? And again, be that middle childhood kid. And think about, say, a friend, your peers. Where is that going to come into play in your social interactions? And it came into play when you were a preschooler, but a little bit different now. Because what do you begin to realize when you get together just to play?
There's children your age that they don't have to do the things you want to do, but they have feelings and wants and desires.
Excellent. All of a sudden you really begin to realize that you got friends your age, your peers, your friends, who do not necessarily at a given time have the same feelings about something, want to do exactly the same things, have different opinions about something as simple as who your favorite sport team is, or who is the best team, or who's the best player, or the best actress, or the best model, or whatever. All of a sudden I begin to realize is that we've got different opinions. Now, how does that impact social relationships? What does it mean to begin to realize that we're different? Different wants, needs, desires, feelings, opinions. What's that mean in terms of our interactions together? Yeah.
I think it creates more of an empathetic and nurturing environment.
It can definitely create much more of an empathetic and nurturing environment, and that is our hope. At the same time, it also has the opportunity to create more what? Well, in a sense, egocentrism, but what do differences often lead to? Well, competition, arguments, conflicts. Exactly. And the hope is that we learn the skills to be able to work through those differences of opinion, these arguments over, what we want to do or how to make decisions. And in the process, the hope is that we gain more understanding of one another and a greater degree of empathy. That we hopefully will carry those learning social skills into the next stage and into adulthood. But they clearly change relationships because all of a sudden life is not quite as simple as we thought that it was. And all of a sudden we realize that there really are different perspectives. Or that we can even experience a different emotion in the same experience together. This particular experience or what we're playing, I'm really excited and having a good time, and somebody else is really bored. And all of a sudden realize that there are different emotions at a different time. And so again, this does begin to decline. Hopefully children begin to acquire greater understanding, more empathy of others, and more social skills as they interact. And the decline in egocentrism opens the door for that to happen. Another thing that's characteristic is that memory improves. And a lot of it is because of their ability to organize their thoughts and to use memory strategies. Now, particularly young middle childhood children often have to be kind of guided and directed in this process, but they are acquiring those mental abilities, again, to apply those, again, when instructed to do so. Now, and again, you don't need to know this for the test, but just to have kind of some thoughts about what we're talking about here, think about your own, what strategies do you utilize to remember information? Because again, there are many different strategies, and often students will use sometimes very different strategies. And actually, this age group will start to learn some of their own strategies. Can you think of the strategy that you typically use? Because a lot of the kinds of material you're learning, a lot of it in this class, unfortunately, is a lot of memorization. And so you have to apply some kind of a strategy to remember it in order to take the test. What do you use? Anybody have any strategies that they pretty consciously use? Yeah, Kendra?
Sequence and association.
Okay, a common strategy is putting things in sequence and association, associating one thought or one image with something else. I've even known students who have come up with acronyms or words or rhymes. If they can remember the acronym, it helps them link that to something that's in their notes. And it may be real simple kinds of, it may be something as simple as the word boat. And each one of those letters helps them remember a particular statement in their notes. Any other strategies that anyone tend to use? I use lots of rehearsal. I just rehearse it over and over again in my mind until it became pretty automatic. Some people, and to some extent I can do this, literally create almost visual images in their minds, of what's in their notes, and actually can kind of see it. Now, it does create a little bit of a problem if the mind goes blank, and you can't pull up that mental image if that's the only linkage you have to your notes. But again, a lot of different strategies. And again, part of, as they're acquiring these mental abilities of organization and logic, allows them again to use memory strategies, and their memories tend to improve. Attention spans improve because of the ability to avoid distractions. And again, a lot of this is just gaining greater self-control, to delay gratification, i.e. to focus on something that may not be as gratifying as the alternative, to control impulse control, or the lack of impulse control. And so they're able to act more intentionally. And again, some of that is because of, again, the learning process, the school system, where, again, a lot of emphasis, a lot of focus, again, on learning academic skills and how you really have to focus on those activities, those tasks to acquire those abilities. If you remember when we were talking during the preschool years, this is kind of a flip-flop of that. We talked about for the preschooler, that really the enjoyment was what was important in terms of doing of a task. As we move through the middle childhood years, that tends to shift, and that the quality of the product begins to emerge as important rather than just the process. And what probably contributes most to that change? Adults, and more specifically, how so? What role do adults play? What kind of shifts where children really start to be focused on the quality of that outcome rather than the process? Grading, exactly. School. And again, from kindergarten on, there becomes a tremendous focus on grades. And grades become a reflection of the quality of the task or the work. And sometimes what happens is that children may become more concerned about what? And what does become the main focus? And students today are very much the same. What becomes most important? The grade. Getting an A. An A is a reflection of, supposedly, knowledge, quality. A, we look at levels of A, B, C, and D, and A would be the preferred grade, reflecting the quality. But it does not necessarily guarantee what? We would hope that it does. That you actually learned it, again, if you think of learning in terms of something that's long-lasting, or that you really have gained an understanding. You may have been able to demonstrate at some level of understanding. It may be even possible to get the correct answer, but not know what. Why it's correct or how it's correct. One of the things that I find interesting, and again, you can see that where teachers are, again, at the elementary school level are concerned about process, is one of the things that my son has every night is math. And I find it, and one of the things that the teacher requires, and I understand it, is that the students are required not only to write the answer down, but to show their work. And you'd be amazed at how often my son can come up with the right answer, but not know how he got it. Or how the process of getting there isn't consistent with the answer. And so one of the things that we spend a lot of time on in the evening again, is focusing on the process. And again, how easy it is. We were looking at an example the other night. Very simple example. It was a division problem. It was 25 divided by 7 or something like that, And at one level he understands, but he simply set the problem up wrong. And so rather than having 25 divided by 7, he had 7 divided by 25. Now, 7 divided by 25, the answer that he had was correct in terms of what 7 divided by 25 was. But the problem was that, it wasn't, what he did wasn't what the problem was asking. So at one level he did something correct, yet he set it up incorrectly. And every once in a while he'll do that to where he really understands some of the process but gets another part of the process confused. But also it's very obvious to him what's most important is that he gets the answer right and that he gets an A for his homework. More so than how he got the correct answer sometimes. And so it's real important, I think, that we continue to emphasize process as well as product. But it clearly shifts because we do really put a strong emphasis on, as you said, grading and the importance of grading. And from kindergarten on, kids learn very quickly, not only where they're at in the class, but what else? Where everyone else is. I'll never forget, and this would have been the early elementary school years, going into an elementary school, and in the cafeteria was kind of in the center of the room when you came in the front doors. And then all the classrooms were kind of off to the side of the cafeteria, which is also the general meeting room for PTAs and stuff. And they had, and I understood part of the motivation, and they had along all of the walls these little spaceships. And then in the spaceships represented where you were in your math understanding. And again, in the early ages, you're basically just expected to count. Do you know your zeros, and then do you know your ones? And so as you mastered one number, then your spaceship moved. And then over at the very end, when you had finally mastered your tens or whatever it was, then there was this big symbol that represented that you had what? You had arrived. You had mastered these skills. And so obviously, what was the intent of all these little spaceships along the wall? It was intended, and I'm sure, and I'm sure at some level it did, was intended to motivate kids because they could see where their spaceship had moved. And at some level, I think it was successful. But I'm not sure it was always successful because why? Because you betcha. Because not only do you know where you're at, and if you're one of those kids that's doing really well and really understand it, man, my spaceship is moving and I'm excited and I can see that movement. But what if I'm the kid and we're 3/4 of the way down in the year and my spaceship is still down on the 1s and 2s and everybody else's is up here? And everybody in the world knows it. I'm not sure what that always does to my self-esteem. And obviously I'm having some struggles in terms of learning those skills. So at one level for some kids I think it tends to be, but what you watch is, sometimes is that motivation towards the end product, i.e. arriving, mastering, accomplishing. That's a good thing, but then some having difficulty with the process to be able to get there. And again, from the beginning of elementary school right on up through college, product, quality of the product, grades, evaluations become increasingly important. And it's interesting that I find, again, even at the college level, not always, but there are clearly some students that what is most important at the end of the semester? GPA. What's most important is what letter grade I got in the course, more so than what I may have learned in the course. What I learned, what I understand is more about process. Grade is more about the quality of the outcome. And again, sometimes much more concerned, and sometimes more concerned that all that's important is to get the grade than what I acquired and what I can apply and what I can use down the road. Now, hopefully that's not typical. But again, quality of the product becomes important. I don't want to say a lot about, but I do want to mention, just because as we think about grades and we think about outcomes, beginning with middle childhood, this whole notion of intelligence really begins to emerge. In the middle childhood, child doesn't often use the word intelligent. What is the word that they frequently use in terms of how they define themselves and how they define other peers? Smart. Yeah, they're not going to use the word intelligence. They're going to talk about whether I feel smart or whether I'm smart or whether somebody else is not smart. So the issue or the concept of intelligent really does play into it, and again comes back to that sense of the importance on outcomes. And again the importance on grades and where I'm at in comparison or relationship to my peers. Now, if you were to define intelligence, or if you were to define an intelligent person, how would you define that per individual?
By their success.
Okay, by their success. What else, when you think of an intelligent person, what do you think of? Or if you were to think of yourself as a smart or intelligent person, what do you think that means? Because I think it has different meanings for different people. Or is there only one definition of intelligence? Okay, one of the common, I think, distinguishing characteristics, which I think are both reflective of overall intelligence, is we often think of book smarts, people who tend to have a great deal of knowledge about something or about things. But other people may not necessarily excel academically in terms of that book smart, but they may be very good at, and what do we mean by street smarts? Life experience. They may be very successful, very good at mastering life or the challenges of life. They may be excellent problem solvers, and very good at setting goals and achieving goals, but may not necessarily have the same level of, using your term, book knowledge, but still may be considered, very, very intelligent and very smart. And in fact, I bet all of us know somebody who have very limited formal education, but in the course of their lives have been extremely successful, and we would consider, in some cases, very brilliant. But yet they don't necessarily have a lot of formal education and wouldn't necessarily be considered overly intellectual, from an academic kind of perspective. Yet we would consider them in some ways equally or maybe even more so in terms of intelligence. And so I think when we think about intelligence, we may want to look at more of a broad definition. I like this definition. There are many definitions of intelligence. This one talks about verbal ability, problem-solving skills, and I think the part that I like best is the ability to adapt to and learn from life's everyday experiences. Now, this is clearly, and this would take into consideration, again, book smarts, academic skills, knowledge, but is more than that. And I think in order for us to be successful, we probably really need to be intelligent, but from a broader perspective. Surely and hopefully the knowledge that we're gaining, in our academic pursuits and in our coursework is going to be very valuable and useful to us. But also our life experiences is a very important learning environment as well. And so we want to integrate both of those into terms of being very broad-based, well-rounded, educated people. And I think here at the university we talk a lot about educating people to be successful in life, and I think we mean that in a broader sense than just the academic coursework that you take, but the life experiences that you gain as well over the course of your life. So with that, I think it's important to understand, even though we have lots of indicators of intelligence, that overall intelligence is an indirect measure. We really can't measure overall intelligence and say that this person is more intelligent using some kind of a quantitative measure than another. Yeah.
So how does that relate to IQ tests?
Good question. Looking at, and we'll come back to that in terms of, you weren't predicting it. But again, it is an excellent question in terms of IQ tests and in terms of what do they, and again, a lot of times when we think about intelligence, what we think about is IQ. And intelligent quotients, or IQ, consist of an individual's mental age. That's how it's calculated. But what IQ tests really do is they simply test, and any type of it, many intelligent tests simply test certain mental abilities are certain aspects of knowledge that we possess about something, or our ability to mentally process information. But they're not necessarily indicators of a person's overall intelligence. I may have an average IQ, probably do have an average IQ, but it is not necessarily totally reflective of what in terms of my life overall. It's not necessarily a reflection of how successful I may or may not become in terms of my ability to adapt and deal with everyday life situations, my ability to take, quote, that average IQ and apply that in situations. And a lot of times people think, well, they just have an average IQ, so they're just going to have average abilities and capabilities. When we talk about IQ tests, all they really are doing is testing, my level of mental processing and my knowledge about certain things with other peers at a given age, at a given time.
So it's like saying you have an 8-year-old who mentally thinks like a 10 or 11.
That's exactly right. And so if you have an 8-year-old whose mental abilities, are more reflective of the typical 10-year-old, their IQ is going to be higher. Average IQ would be what? 100, yeah. If I'm 5 years old, and then, and that's my chronological age, and that, that my IQ is typical of other children 5 years of age, my mental age, in terms of how I test out, then my IQ would be 100. And that would be considered average, which is where I am in relationship to most of the average kids, at my age. But some kids clearly have mental, are operating at mental capacities or understanding above that, and so they would have higher IQs. What IQs do a fairly good job of is predicting how well I may perform academically. How well I'm likely to succeed in a school environment. And they do a pretty good job of that. But it doesn't necessarily will predict or indicate how I may do in other areas, of my life. Yeah.
So a person's IQ probably changes a lot.
Yes. Excellent. You'd almost thought I prompted you all today. One of the things I think is the myth is the notion that our IQ is fixed. I don't think there's any question that clearly there are some genetic or biological influences in terms of some people's capacities or predispositions for acquiring mental abilities. But a lot of that has to do with the environment in which they live in and the opportunities that they are presented with and how they apply those mental capacities. But I think what's more important is to understand, and I think your point is excellent, is we tend to think that, and what happens is we often have an IQ test at some point in our lives. And how many in here have had an IQ test? How many have had more than one? One person. What's interesting is many of us can remember having an IQ test, and it happened one time in our lives at some particular point in time. And what do most of us tend to believe? I did. I still have the same IQ. That whatever IQ I had when I was in 3rd grade, that was fixed, and that was my IQ forever to be. Now, over the course of my life, it may have remained rather consistent. I don't really know, because I don't know that I ever had one done other than whenever I had that one done. And I don't remember now. It was in elementary school. I know that. I know I never had one done when I was in. We took other tests, but not an IQ test. In adolescence, and sure haven't had one done in adulthood. And I wouldn't want to guess where my IQ has gone, since then. But we tend to think that it's something that's fixed. What it is really simply an indication of how we're performing in terms of mental processes and level of understanding at that particular time compared to others our age. And if we had it done really early on and we had some different experiences in our lives, different opportunities, and so maybe someone began to work with us in some of those areas, such as verbal skills, then that aspect may improve greatly and our IQ, would go up. Or maybe I had a capacity for a high aptitude for learning, but for whatever reasons that was never tapped into, and I was never really motivated or encouraged, to really utilize those abilities, and so I got bored and uninterested, and so my capacities and abilities may really be there, but really never tapped into them, and so my IQ may actually change, over time. So it's not a fixed quantity of intelligence that we're born with, though I think that's what we tend to often believe. Doesn't mean that it doesn't remain relatively stable, but a lot of it I think has to do with our experiences. All right, we've looked at physical development, we've looked at cognitive development. Now we want to shift and begin to take a look at emotional development, particularly, again, going back to Erikson. And again, looking at psychosocial development, that's looking at the development of personality and playing a key role, again, in terms of self-concept, self-esteem. So real quickly, let's just kind of review, again, looking at Erikson. We're moving away from Piaget, moving over to Erikson. First stage was, we usually remember this one pretty easy, trust versus mistrust. Excellent. Second stage, anyone remember? Won't necessarily need to know it for the this test. Well, actually, I guess it is on this. No, this was on the last test. Kind of the 2-year-olds. Anyone remember? Shamed out was the negative outcome. What was on the positive outcome? What was the 2-year-old wanting? Autonomy. Excellent. So autonomy, again, versus shame and doubt. Then we move to the preschool years. This will be on our next test. I think it's the hardest one to remember. Initiative versus guilt. Excellent. If you can hang on to those, you won't have any problem. Now, here's what happens is students often will get initiative versus guilt confused with the fourth stage. And again, this would be characteristic of the elementary school, middle childhood years. And part of the problem is that there are a lot of I's. So when we're looking at this stage, we're looking at industry versus inferiority. Again, it's real easy to get those confused. So third stage, you got initiative versus guilt. Here we've got industry versus inferiority. Industry's kind of really has a lot to do with, if you think about an industry, I mean just formally an industry does what? Any type of industry builds things. They produce things. And here, in a sense, when we talk about industry, we're thinking about it in a lot of the same ways, but more in the sense of the outcomes of what I do. Where are the places that I am able to achieve, that I'm successful at, that I feel productive, and a sense of accomplishment. That's a lot of what's happening here. And we'll look at some of the major areas in a child's life where that's likely to occur. And so I either feel this sense of, from Erikson's terms, industry or achievement, or I feel like which is the inferiority. A person who feels inferior basically internally believes what? That they failed. What else? Along the same lines. I'm not good enough. I can't do it. And when we think about inferiority complexes, which hopefully very few people experience, an inferiority complex is the individual who basically believes what about themselves? They can't do anything. Or I sure can't do anything as well as anybody else. Or everybody else does it better than me. And so if I have an internal inferiority sense of not being able to do it, then how does that impact my life? Yeah, you don't take challenges, you don't try new things. Part of the reason is because I basically believe that I can't. So what is the reason? I remember I was working with a group of young children at one point on math. And one of the things I really struggled with for a long time and couldn't quite make sense out of wasn't so much their ability to learn, but what I found is their greatest ability was they didn't try. Now, see, and my thinking was that if I don't try, what's the given outcome? Failure. I mean, if I don't do the work, I'm going to fail. So it would seem like to me that by not trying, I'm guaranteeing myself to fail. And so after a while, I began to try to understand, so what would be the motive? So why would kids not try, knowing that they were going to fail? Any thoughts? They think they'll fail. And so what's the difference? You're exactly right. What I began to discover is that internally what they basically believed was, if I try, I'm going to fail. And so what they concluded was it was a lot easier for them not to try and fail Because why? It's how they could justify the failure. And it did make sense to me after I thought about it differently. Again, they did protect themselves from going through that personal sense of failure. Because if I don't try and I fail, what's the reason for my failure? Or what isn't the reason? Yeah, see, it's not that I can't do it. I may actually tell myself I can, even though I don't really believe I can. But I didn't fail because of my ability. I simply failed because I didn't do it. And it was a lot easier to somehow accept failure at that level for having not tried than if I really did try, if I really did put the effort forth and I really did try and then I failed that test, then what would I have to conclude? Where does it become a reflection on? Your abilities are something more about yourself internally. You know, that I can't do it. I don't understand it. And it was a whole lot easier for students to begin to conclude, you know, and again, the internal message probably was an internal belief that I'm not sure I can, but I could somehow justify and live with having failed, and then I could make all kinds, well, it doesn't really matter, it's not that important, I don't really need this, and so I'm not going to do it. And so, I got an F, you know, but I got an F because I didn't do it. And somehow it was easier to somehow accept that. And what I began to find as I began to work with this group of elementary school kids is that once they started to realize and started to believe that they could do it by kind of breaking it down into small steps, that then they begin to realize and put forth effort to once again try. And then that's how you could almost kickstart them to begin to try again. And then once they started to experience some slow successes, then we're more motivated to really work at it. But first they first fundamentally had to believe that they really could learn how to do the math. And they basically concluded there was no way that they could do it. And over some time we were able to kind of change that perception that they couldn't learn it, but that they actually could. And then it began to kind of turn around that cycle with them. So again, what we're looking at, you know, do kids develop a sense of achievement, an internal sense that I can master different things in my life, or do I develop an internal message that I can't do it, I'm not capable, I am inferior, and that others are better than I am? And so what we'll look at next time are what are some of the things that contribute to developing a positive sense of industry and achievement, particularly at this stage of life.